Record. Okay, that should be good. Now I've got fallacies up, but let's do a few more categorical logic problems first. Also, the midterm is back up for another week. I changed a few, not many, but I changed a few of the questions. Okay, yeah, and mine might be as well. So far, it's been okay, but if I get kicked off a bunch, then we'll stop. And if you get kicked off, I'll understand why. Yeah, I think I put it up until Sunday, maybe. I forget. Friday, Saturday, Sunday, something like that. You have the rest of the work week anyway. Cool. Yeah, hopefully it'll be easier, right? And hopefully just taking the test was a learning opportunity itself, and now you'll do better. Cool. Yeah. And it's mostly the propositional logic problems that I changed, so you can't just remember that you got it wrong and then say invalid instead and not actually do any of the work, right? So it's mostly those. A lot of the rest of it I kept the same because they are basic stuff you should know. Okay. So, just for the exercise, before we move on to the next section, I thought we could do a few more categorical logic exercises. So, were there anyone have any questions or concerns about anything else before I do that? Okay, yeah, the blocking out part, the technique. Well, I mean, you can at least just match the kind of statement that it is to what it's supposed to look like, right? You can have your little chart up. In fact, I should have done that instead. Let's see here. No, well, hopefully you have it in your notes. I can't quickly change it to the other slide, so. What happened here? Wait a minute. Something happened. This was supposed to be a separate window. Okay, there we go. It looks like I'm doing nothing, but I am trying to set everything up correctly. Give you an opportunity to talk about something. Yeah, make a chart for it. Remember, there's just four of them, and the blacking out is just for the universal statements. Yeah, okay, yeah. Then it's basically you just black out anything that's not outside of the other circle because you're trying to say everything that's in this circle also belongs in this circle, right? Like all humans are mammals. There's no humans that are not mammals. So it's sort of we're blacking out that possibility. We're blacking out the possibility of non-mammal humans, right? Well, if you have the chart in front of you, that'll make sense. Okay, well, so let me switch the camera here. Um, I usually don't show you this part because it's so unglamorous, as though any of this is glamorous. Let's see here. Can I get this a little closer? Okay, looks a bit messy. but it's better than nothing. I was going to print some stuff out, but then it turned out my printer is not communicating with my my computer. Okay, so let's just do this one right here. The light's kind of weird. Let's see. So it says no P's or Q's. Some Q's are not R's. Some P's are not R's. Some Q's are not R's, and therefore some P's are not R's. Now notice, you know, those P's and Q's, again, could be any category, right? Those could be cats and dogs. They could be police officers. They could be trees. It could be anything, as long as it's a plural noun. Just for the sake of the exercise, I just made it P's and Q's. Okay. So, I'm going to ask you... okay, I have to go back to where I can actually see you. Let's see here. What would be our first step here? We need to label the circles, right? How do we determine how to label the circles? Does anyone know? Does anyone remember? If you can see this, hopefully. Yeah, we do look at the premises. We have to represent the premises on the circles, right? Yeah, and Rachel's pointing out the premise or not the premise, but the term they both have in common, right? So there's two premises, yes. It's the term that both of the premises share, which in this case is what? What's going to go at the top? Q, yes, right? So if this was an exercise, right? You're looking at this and I'm saying, evaluate this argument for validity by using Venn diagrams, okay? This is what you do. You'd have the three circles. Your first step would be, okay, let me look at the premises. What do both of the premises have in common? Q, okay? Put that in the middle. And that makes sense, right? It's the middle term that they both share. And then what do you do to figure out what to put here and here? Where do you look? We know it's going to be Q's and R's, but P's and R's, but where are we going to put them? What determines that? Does anybody remember? All these little things are important to get right, because if you don't, then you'll set yourself up for a mistake. So all these little details, very important to do it all correctly. It's a very simple procedure, but if you mess up on one little thing, the order the terms are in the conclusion. That's right. Everybody see that? Yes, and Cassandra is right as well. The subject term and the predicate term, right? The subject term is always on the left, the predicate term is on the right, and it's the conclusion. So we're going to put the P on the left and the R on the right. Just like that. Okay? So that's your basic setup. So always remember that. The top middle circle is labeled according to the middle term, what both of the premises have in common. And the two bottom circles is determined by the conclusion, right? Whatever's on the left, you put on the left. Whatever's on the right, put on the right. Okay? Subject, predicate of the conclusion. Okay. Then your next step, remember, you ignore the conclusion for now, right? This is a little bit different from in propositional logic. Here, all we want to do is simply plug in the premises by using those two techniques that you learned about, the blackout technique and the X technique. Okay, Anna's typing something. Let me wait for a second. So the question obviously is, oh yeah, it is. Let me double check if I can make it less blurry. Let's see. Kind of hard to get any better than that. Although I remember last time, put it up a little bit higher. like I said, I wanted to make this look all nice by printing some stuff up, but my printer would not allow me. Okay. So it says no P's or Q's. Some Q's are not R's. Some P's are not R's. Okay. Well, then, what we want to do is plug in the premises, right? So, just go premise by premise. Just look at the first premise first. Sometimes you'll find that you can't do a premise right away. You need to do the second one first. We'll see if we come across one like that. I'm not sure if I did it like this or not. Well, in fact, I think it is. Let's just see. Let's just see what happened if I did the second. If I try to do the second premise first, right? What if this premise was listed first? If you try to do that, let's see what it would look like. Some Q's are not R's, right? So we're looking at this circle and this circle, right? So I'm doing just as a for instance, I'm doing the second premise first, just to show you something. I'm not sure if it's the case or not. Let's just see. If it goes fine, then it goes fine. If it goes wrong, then that'll be a learning experience as well. All right, so we're just going to do this one first, just to see what happens. And it says some Q's are not R's. So there's some Q's that are not R's. If we use our technique, that means we have to put an X somewhere in the Q circle outside of the R circle, right? Everybody remembers that? The problem is, if we're going to put an X somewhere, it matters where we put it, right? Because we could put it here, in which case we'd just be saying there are some Q's that are not R's. That's fine. But what if it's over here? That would also say some Q's are not R's, but then we'd also be saying that some Q's are P's, but we don't know that, right? We haven't looked at any other premises yet. So if that's all you had, you wouldn't know where to put it. You see that? So if there was no further clue, sometimes this happens, and you simply cannot do it. If you cannot figure out where to put it, then you'd put it somewhere on the line right here, and you'd say it's indeterminate. However, in this case, we have our other premise to help us out. Okay, so let me review what just happened, right? I tried to plug in this premise by using the X technique, right? Some Q's are not R's. Normally, if you just ignored the P circle, you'd put a Q right in you put an X right in the Q circle to say that there are some Q's that are not R's, right? Some Q's are not in the R circle. So you'd put it over here somewhere. The problem is that we have this P circle, and this is not like a universal statement where it just all gets blacked out. In this case, we just don't know where to put that X. Okay, you see how that would be a problem. So if that happens, try to do the other premise first and see if that narrows it down a little bit. And I think in this case it will, because now let's do the first premise like we were going to do initially anyway, right? So notice we could not plot this premise because it's ambiguous, okay? But now we have no P's or Q's. So that means there's no P's, right? There's nothing in here that's also a member of Q. So we use the blackout technique, right? We're saying there's no overlap between P and Q. There's nothing that's both a P and a Q, right? That's what premise one is saying, right? There's nothing here. There's no member of P and Q together, right? So it's all blacked out. This says no P's or Q's. Okay? That's fine. That's easy because that's not an ambiguous thing. We can go right through this line. We can go right through the circle. We can just ignore it when it's a universal statement like that. Because if we're going to represent this as being true, that means there's nothing in here either. Okay? There might be a P that's an R. It's available over here. But there's no P that's an R that's also a Q. Because the first premise says no P's are Q's. And so that rule has to be followed. So we can just X it all out. Black it all out. So now, hopefully that's clear, right? No P's or Q's. This should just look like your chart if you have one, right? If you're ignoring this circle, no P's or Q's, you just black out the middle part. Now when we go to that second premise, some Q's are not R's. Now let's look at it again. Right, now we want to put an X in the Q circle outside of the R circle. Well, I can't put it here because that's all blacked out. Right? I can't put it here because that's all blacked out, and it's in the R circle. We don't want that. And I can't put it here because we're saying some Q's are not R's. So the only place I can put it is right here. Some Q's are not R's, and this time we know we can only put it here because this has already been blacked out because of the previous premise. So do you see that? So if you had done that first premise first, it might have been confusing. You wouldn't know where to put that X. When that happens, try to do the other premise first and see if that helps. Sometimes it does not, and when it does not, then the argument is just invalid by default. When you can't plot it, if you don't know exactly where to put the X according to the rules, not if you personally don't know where to put it, you don't get to just put it on the line, right? There's a specific time and place when you have to do that, right? It just depends on the premise that you're dealing with. Okay, any questions on that one? Is that very confusing? Kind of confusing? Or somewhat clear? I'll do another one. Maybe it was a bad idea to start out with a problematic one. It's just, if you do these on your own, you're going to find those. So it's good for me to flag them while we're doing them. No? Okay, so let's see. Let's do another one here. All A's are B's, no B's or C's. Oh, sorry, we didn't even evaluate for validity. That was the whole point of it. Well, this is an important part too, just being able to plot the premises. But can somebody tell me, is this conclusion represented in here? Does this say that there are some P's that are not R's? So this is important. So look at the chart. Does this say some P's are not R's? Well, remember, some people saying no are correct, right? Some involves a little X, right? So if this said some P's are not R's, it means there would have to be a little X in the P circle. Right? That's how you represent some P's are not R's. You'd have to put an X in the P circle outside of the R circle. But it's not there. So the conclusion is not represented just by plugging in the premises, and that means it's invalid. You see? That's right, so it's not valid. Yeah. If it was valid, then we would have just seen a little X already there, just by plugging in the premises. Yeah, so it's invalid, exactly, yeah. Because again, remember, with an invalid argument, it's impossible for the conclusion to be false if the premises are true. Right? But here, clearly, we have true premises being represented, but the conclusion didn't just show up on its own, which it would if it was logically valid, if it was deductively valid. Okay? So, all A's are B's, no B's or C's, no A's or C's. First things first, check to see what the middle term is, right? That would be a B. That's what they both have in common. So we put that right there. And then we look at the conclusion to figure out what to put down here. You just copy it, A and C in order. A on the left, C on the right. Right? Subject term on the left, predicate term on the right. Oh yeah, you can't read that one. Okay. So it says all A's are B's. All A's are B's. no B's are C's. And then conclusion, no A's are C's. Sure, yeah. Next semester, I'm gonna have to come up with a better system to do this. I got one of those little writing pads, but that plugs into my computer, but that just doesn't work at all for some reason. I have to get a better one or something. Yeah, I apologize for those who, if you can't read this. Okay, so we got them all labeled. So now all we have to do is plug in the premises and then see if the conclusion shows up. See, it's really not that complicated. Once you have the basic format down, then you just have to, you have to look at your chart, of course. And if you're using universal statements, it's usually pretty easy. All A's are B's. All A's are B's. So that means there's nothing in the A circle outside of the B circle. Right? So we can totally fill all this in, right? It's not like when we're putting the X in and we don't know where to put it. Right? In this case, we're saying that all of the A's are B's. So that means only this area can be left over. Now notice that means we're not saying an A can't be a C just because we're filling this out, right? Because we're doing all of this. Remember, look, we're blacking out everything that's outside the B circle. So that means if you're an A, you've got to be a B. Okay, I'm not making it look any better by by continually sketching over it like this. You get the idea. Okay. So we've represented all A's and all A's are B's. And notice we didn't have to make up our minds about anything, right? It's still possible that an A could be a C because this is left open. You see that? It just means that if you're an A, you also have to be a B. So this has to be blacked out right here. Okay? So that's just all A's are B's. This, if you looked at your chart, this is what it would look like. A universal affirmative. You just always black out the whole left part to represent the fact that if you're an A, you cannot be anywhere in the darkness, right? If you're an A, you've got to be in here somewhere. Okay? Then no B's are C's. There aren't any B's. There's no member of this club that's a member of this club. Right? That means we have to black out any overlap between the two. There's nothing in the B club that's inside the C club. So use the blackout technique to show that there's nothing in there. If you're a B at all, you're not a C. Right? So then we've represented both of our premises. Do we see the conclusion? Does it say no A's are C's? Did the conclusion show up all on its own? Yep. Yes, it did. And it's valid, right? It says right here, right, all we did is plug in the two premises. We didn't purposely plug in the conclusion. Right? We just plugged in the premises, wrote them all out in here. And now we can look. Is there a space in the A circle and the C circle for an A to live? Could an A be a C? No. All the overlap between A and C has gotten blacked out just by plugging in the two premises. That conclusion has been ruled out. Or sorry, that possibility has been ruled out. You cannot have an A that's also a C if both of these premises are true. It just follows logically, and you could see it visually. Right? You can see that if both of these premises are true, the conclusion must be true. Once you've plugged in both of the premises, notice, right, for the first premise, we blacked out this part of it and this. And then for the second premise, we blacked out this part of it and this. All right, so notice that we blacked out half of this for each premise. And then once you get to the conclusion, you've blacked out both of them already. And that just says what the conclusion says. All right. So just by plugging in the premises, you've already plugged in the conclusion. So it's valid in this case. Did we want to do one more? Or no? Yeah, do one more. Let's see. Does anyone here? Let's do one person at a time. Give me a suggestion for a premise. Should we do an all statement or a none statement? Just to see what happens. Just to be unpredictable. Maybe we'll get into a weird situation. Okay, we'll make an all P's are Q's. What should I do for the next one? Remember, it's got to have a P or a Q in it, because we're going to have a middle term. Does anyone want to suggest something? No Q's are S. Sure, that'll work. Well, you both had the same one. Wait, is that just the same one as the one we just did? Yeah, that would just turn into the same one. We don't want that. Here, let's do a sum. Some P's are R. How about that? Now, I think that entails a conclusion just by looking at it, but let's check to see if I'm right, right? Just very quickly looking at it. If all P's are Q's and some P's are R's, wouldn't that mean that some P's have to be R's? Some P's are R's. I think that's the logical conclusion. All right. Let's see if that's right. Let's see if my intuition's correct about this. So again, I wish you could just read it easily. Maybe some of you can. Okay. Oops. The right way. Okay. Middle term, that's easy, right? P. Oh, we do have a problem here. You see that? So this is actually a problem. You're not allowed to have this. Already, that's... Okay, well, let's just try it and see. All P's are Q's. All P's are R's. Oh, I see what I did for the conclusion. Okay. I had meant to say this. Some Q's are R's. That's what I was trying to say. Okay. And all P's are Q's. Yeah, I take back what I said earlier about it being valid. I think it's all changed from what I thought initially. Let's just do it and see, okay? We do have a middle term, P right here, okay? And now we do have two separate terms right here. That's good, right? Look at the conclusion. Put the Q right there and the R right there. Okay. Good so far, right? Everybody knows how to do this part, hopefully. Again, just look at the term that both of the premises have in common to put right here. I look at the conclusion and copy that. Okay. All P's are Q's. Okay. All P's are Q's. That means there's nothing in the P circle that isn't also in the Q circle. So I'm going to leave no space open anywhere except for right there. Right, we know that if you're a P, right, if you're in this circle, you know you're hanging out here somewhere in the Q circle as well. Okay. Some P's are R's. Some P's are R's. Okay, so there's some members within the P circle, right? So it's got to be inside the circle. We're going to put an X somewhere in the circle, and it's got to be in the R circle. Well, notice I can't put it right here. This has already been blacked out, right? So that's kind of nice. It's one of those ones where if you started with that premise, you wouldn't know where to put it, right? If you started with this one, you wouldn't know whether to put it here or here. But luckily, we've already blacked this out. So we know that for some P's or R's, we're going to have to put it right here. Some P's are R's, right? There's at least one member of the P circle that's also in the R circle. And notice the only place we could put it is right here in the Q circle, right? And what does the conclusion say? Some Q's are R's. Well, yeah, there's at least one member of Q that's also a member of R. So it is actually valid. It does check out. Okay. Everyone see that? Okay, well, let's stop there. And again, remember I have those, the exercises up. I have those from last year, me going through a bunch of categorical logic exercises. So if this stuff is helpful for you, just following along with someone, just check out that video, right, where you can just kind of follow along and do it. Okay. So there's an X in the center. Yes, there's an X right in the center. Exactly. Yeah. So it's probably because you couldn't see it very well. But yes, it ended up that way. Okay. Those are helpful. Okay, good. Yeah. I mean, sometimes that's the best way. You know, it's someone could tell you all the rules, but you have weird little hiccups and weird little bumps, and those are important. You know, it's good for me to deal with those, so you know how to deal with those. Right. To see somebody do it in real time, I think it's helpful. So for anybody who's still not feeling totally good about the categorical logic exercises, but keep watching those then, if that's helpful. You're kind of getting it right, yeah, but you're not sure why, yeah. Well, I mean, maybe you're just doing it right. I don't know. You're not sure why you're getting it. Yeah, I don't know how to parse that, but yeah, if you're kind of getting it, that's good. Yeah. Okay, well, you know, I'm guessing I'll review both propositional logic and categorical logic when we get close to the final, which will be cumulative. So we will come back to this. And if you're not quite getting it yet, yeah, I encourage you to do some of those exercises. Okay. And yeah, you can also just find resources online. And it just sort of depends. I could link some stuff as well, but everybody likes different approaches, so it might be better for you to just to sort of go look on the internet and see which person makes the most sense out of it for you. Right. Okay, well then, let's move on to something completely different, although related. Remember, this is all related. This whole class is basically about arguments. And by arguments, we mean something like coming up with a conclusion based on premises, right? This is how many of our beliefs are formed in this way. You go, oh, I see that that's true and that's true. I betcha this is true, right? We do this kind of thing all the time. And that's just to remind you that all of this is still about this very basic human thing that we all do, okay? Where you look at the world and you come up with conclusions based on what you see. Right? That's an argument, right? It's weird to call that an argument, so that's why I encourage you not to think of the word argument in the usual sense at all when we're doing this. In this context, an argument is just basically when you're moving from a set of from a data set, call it, right? Some information that you have that you think is correct, and then extrapolating from that, drawing a conclusion from that data set. And we do this all the time, right? You might even say that we do it in a weird way, just walking around making assumptions about what the nature of reality is, right? That when you look out the window and everything looks normal, you expect that when you open the door, you will not find terrifying dragons flying around and things like that, right? Because if you had made that conclusion, your behavior would be different. Okay? Strange kind of example, but it just goes to show that as human beings, we're constantly having to update our beliefs about the world, right? We're constantly doing this, and we're taking beginning data and then coming up with a conclusion, right? And that's what you've been seeing in propositional logic and in categorical logic, where you can see it very laid out in a very abstract way, and it can become difficult to see the connection between that very abstract kind of work and the kind of thing you do in everyday context, but the link is there, right? Even if it's hard to see. And a lot of the logic stuff, it's not so much that I think you're going to translate your everyday situations into logic. I don't think most people do that. But you are using a part of your brain in a very intentional way. And it's a part of your brain that you don't necessarily rely on in this way very often. Most of the time, we are happy just to use those heuristic devices, right? We're happy just to go with what makes sense to us intuitively, right? So when you do logic, you're sort of breaking that down a little bit, and you're really making sure, with deductive logic anyway, that transition from your initial data set to your conclusion. When you're doing deductive logic, there's a real right and wrong about that, right? And the thing is, we do use deductive logic. We do use those kind of if-then statements when we're reasoning about our decisions in life, what we're going to do, right? We think, well, if I do this, then this might happen. If I do this, then this might happen. But I don't want that to happen, so I'm not going to do this. You see, that's just the modus tollens, right? You use that. It's just that we also use them very badly. And so it's, on the one hand, it's good to slow down and really become aware of deductive reasoning. Make sure that you're not just doing it on autopilot, but you're actually aware of how you're drawing a conclusion. But then also using this part of your brain, this very abstract kind of logic part of your brain, right? You're exercising that, and hopefully, now I have no way to quantify whether that's going to make a difference. But hopefully, anyway, just by using that muscle, right, that part of your brain, you'll sort of pump up that muscle a little bit, right? And hopefully that's overall going to make some sort of difference. But here, it's going to be a little bit less abstract, and you'll be able to hopefully recognize these sorts of things from your everyday life. These sorts of things, I mean fallacies. That's what we're going to look at next. And fallacies still have to do with arguments. It's just not going to be in this very rigorous, abstract way, mathematical type way that we've been doing. Okay? So fallacies. What is a fallacy? It's bad reasoning, right? Is there a fallacy diagram? No, there won't be any diagrams for it. Although, I mean, I think you can find them online. I think you can find these little pictographs or infographs, right, that give you a whole bunch of them, but it's going to be more definitions than all these symbols and all that stuff. Right? So a fallacy is just a recognized pattern of bad reasoning. So if that's all I tell you, actually you could tell me a couple of fallacies. There's been 2 fallacies that you learned about. Remember, in propositional logic, there were 2 argument forms that were always invalid. Right? That makes that a fallacy, right? It's a recognized pattern. That's wrong. It's bad. It's invalid. Does anybody remember the 2 invalid argument formats that we looked at in propositional logic? Remember, they're named after what you do in the second premise. So I want to see if anybody remembers, just to test you. I mean, this is on the midterm, so I might as well bring it up. Yeah. Denying the consequent. Well, denying the consequent is modus tollens. Denying the consequent is valid, but you're on the right track. Yeah. Denying the antecedent. and affirming the consequence. That's what it is. Yes, Rachel. Yeah, those are two fallacies, right? Because no, it's a recognized pattern of bad reasoning. You can just learn to spot them. Whenever anybody goes, if A then B, not A, therefore not B, you know it's wrong. Now, in the past, you may have been tempted by that line of thought. You may have thought that that sounded right, right? If it's sunny, I'll go to the beach. It's not sunny, so I won't go to the beach. Strictly speaking, that's not logically valid, right? Because you haven't said that you couldn't go for some other reason, right? You see the gremlin. Yeah, good. You can see the gremlin with that kind of, yeah. If you look at the truth table for an invalid argument format, you will see somewhere green, green, red, right? Yes. Tail of green, head of red. That's our gremlin. I'm constantly having to readjust this for people watching later. Okay, there we go. Yeah, denying the antecedent and affirming the consequent. Those are the big ones you've already seen. So those are fallacies, but those are formal fallacies, right? Where you can really see the logical structure of it, and that's how you know it's bad. Straw man is a fallacy, yes, for sure. Yeah, we'll come. So when we look at the fallacies, we're mostly going to look at informal fallacies. So informal fallacies, you can't recognize them just by the formats, like you could with denying the antecedent or affirming the consequent. It's not easy to see them like that. Informal fallacies are a little bit more loosey-goosey. Right? So kind of more difficult, kind of easier in a way, but then also more difficult to apply. Like I said, with logic, once you got it, it's on. It's just everything's black and white. Everything's crystal clear. The kind of thing you hope for in life, right? To have complete clarity. You can have that within logic once you get it, right? Once you understand formal logic, you can have crystal clear clarity, and you can know that your answer is correct. But it's a little bit more difficult to get there, right? With informal fallacies, with this fallacy approach, it's perhaps a little bit easier to get the gist of it, but then you don't always have a crystal clear answer. It's not always just provable that the other person engaged in the fallacy that you're accusing them of. It's always going to be a lot of circumstantial stuff around it. And it's not going to be as cut and dry as it is in logic. In logic, it's very cut and dry if your argument is valid or invalid, right? We can prove it mathematically, right? Beyond a shadow of doubt. With fallacies, it's a little bit different. It's always going to be kind of an open argument. And in fact, what I found is that people misuse, people learn fallacies, and what they learn to do is to just bash everyone over the head with them, right? If you go on the internet, you might see a few people who've learned a couple of straw man terms, and then they just like to throw them out all the time. I don't think that's a very good approach, okay? I think primarily you should think of fallacies as something that you are going to be engaged in and you don't want to, right? It should be more something for your own behavior than judging other people's arguments. At least in the sense of if you're going to have a discussion with that person or an argument with that person. I think it's better to avoid labeling them with fallacies. I guess that's my only advice here, right? That if you really want to have a discussion with someone about an important issue, don't just say, that's a straw man, that's an ad hominem, that's an appeal to tradition, right? Don't do it like that is all I'm saying. Now become aware of these and understand them, but I think it's counterproductive in an argument, in a context of having a discussion with someone, to simply bash them over the head with these labels. Right? Instead, you could also just dissect the argument and show where it goes wrong rather than just applying this pre-made label to it. Yeah, appeal to emotion is a persuasion technique. And we'll kind of make a distinction. Sometimes it's hard to draw this distinction between a fallacy and a persuader, right? An emotional persuader. So it's sort of Yeah, there's no clear-cut line between the two. But the usual idea is that with a fallacy, someone's at least appearing as though they're presenting an argument, right? They're appearing as though they're trying to convince you with reasons, the way you're supposed to do, right? With central route persuasion, so it looks like the fallacious arguer is arguing at least, whereas the person who uses rhetorical and emotional ploys, they're not even arguing, right? So we'll see if we can tease out the difference, and it's not always going to be easy to exactly say what the difference is. Fallacies don't really deal in truth. Well, let's see how to answer that. Fallacies have to do with arguments, right? Just like finding out if an argument is invalid. If an argument is fallacious, it means it's a bad argument. That's all it means. It means you cannot trust the conclusion of that argument merely on the basis of that argument. If the argument is fallacious meaning it contains a fallacy, then you just know that you can't trust that argument. Just like an invalid argument. But remember, this is very important, and this is in the midterm, okay? An argument can be invalid, but still have a true conclusion, right? So you can't say your argument is fallacious, therefore your conclusion is false. You cannot say that. All you can say is, I cannot accept your conclusion merely on the basis of that particular argument, because that particular argument is fallacious, so I cannot trust it. Okay? You see how that works? So a fallacy, spotting a fallacy is just like spotting an invalid argument. So in that sense, it does not deal with truth. Yeah. You don't after you've spotted a fallacy, you can't yet say anything about the truth of the conclusion, right? You need some separate arguments. Yeah, okay. Good. So yeah, those ones that you looked at, they're formal fallacies, and that means they're recognized patterns of invalidity, right? A recognized invalid pattern for each of those. And those are recognizable as invalid by doing propositional logic, by just showing that the internal structure just makes it automatically invalid. And that's what you can prove mathematically. And that's why it's called formal. It's a formal fallacy. And that means you can prove it. But the fallacies that we're going to look at now are informal fallacies. And that's a little bit different. It's a little bit trickier. Trickier with an asterisk, right? Because you might say it's much less tricky than propositional logic is, in a way, right? Okay. Here, let's just look at one example. Let me wait and see what Anna's going to say. Yeah. But try to get it over somewhat earlier in the semester. Although, yeah, maybe I should maybe next time I'm going to do propositional logic first, do all that stuff first, then do everything else, and then see if we have time at the end to do psychology. It may have been a mistake to try to do all that psychology at the beginning of the semester. I'll have to reevaluate all that later. Unless you thought it was good to start out that way, I don't know. You had no idea what was coming. Yeah. Oh, okay, good. It helped in your psychology class. Oh, that's good. Okay, so let's look at an example. This is not the example yet. This is just somebody talking. Okay, wait, let me see. Anna's typing. The blue anglefish from, Hank's Fish. And then I see what you're saying there. And then to transition. Yes, that's right. Yeah. But now you've sort of made it through that, right? You can see the light at the end of the tunnel. Look, we're going to have Thanksgiving break, just a couple more weeks after that, and then we'll be done. And then, hey, hopefully, sign up for the Intro to Philosophy class next semester. I've got 2 of those, and I've got an Intro to Philosophy of Religion class as well. That's the first time I've taught that here at CR anyway. If you want to do some actual philosophy, some of you kind of expected more philosophy than just logic. Okay, you're going to HSU. Okay. Okay, cool. Well, HSU has great philosophy professors as well. That's where I got my degree there. I used to like Ben Schaefer, Mary Bachover, John Powell. Yeah, it's good though, Maggie. I mean, just learning, right? A world views thing in high school. That's kind of cool. That's cool that they offered something like that. I've always thought they should do more philosophy and critical thinking in high school. Oh, homeschool. Yeah, that makes sense then. Yeah. Yeah, right now, of course, our kids are being homeschooled. Well, kind of through a program. My 8-year-old. Almost 8-year-old. I'm teaching him logic. Did I tell you guys about that? He's learning some propositional logic. He's doing pretty good in it. We just do it here and there, though. You're following the Grateful Dead, yeah? Well, that's an education as well, isn't it? Life experiences. Okay, let's keep going. I know sometimes we just want to chat, and that's nice too. It's an important part of it all, isn't it? Just having some socializing. Okay. Now, suppose... Okay, no. Suppose Jose says, yesterday, my philosophy professor presented an argument for the idea that we don't actually have free will. Okay? Now, I'm actually doing this in my other class. We're talking about free will. And in fact, I presented some arguments for the idea that we don't have free will. Okay? Now, as a philosophy professor, I have to present that argument, but also arguments for free will. I have to look at all the different angles, of course. But anyway, here's just Jose saying, oh, my philosophy professor told me, that there's an argument for the idea that we actually don't have any free will, even though we think we do. And then somebody responds to that. Alice says, oh, I wouldn't worry about it. I've had that teacher too, and she's a total weirdo. You see? So you see how Alice is responding, right? So Jose is presenting the idea that maybe we don't have free will. The philosophy professor brought this up and presented an argument for the idea that we don't have free will. And Alice, rather than saying, well, we do have free will, and here's why, right? Or rather than saying, okay, well, what's the argument for it? Let me evaluate the argument for the idea that we don't have free will. Alice doesn't do either of those things. Alice simply says, don't worry about the idea that you don't have free will. Forget about it. That teacher is weird. Right? Do you see what's going on there? Basically, Alice is suggesting that Jose can just not think about the argument. Just don't worry about the argument. Don't worry about whether the conclusion is true or not. You can just dismiss it because the person that presented the argument is weird. Yeah, because of the source, right? So this is a particular kind of an argument from the source. Yeah, what you're talking about is called a genetic fallacy. And this is a particular kind of genetic fallacy, an ad hominem genetic fallacy, right? Because of the source, exactly, right? So rather than talking to Jose about the actual argument, well, it is that argument for the idea that we don't have free will. Right? Is there something wrong with it? Right? Is it valid, invalid? Is it inductively strong, inductively weak? Is it relying on faulty premises? That's what you've been learning, right? That's how you evaluate an argument. You look at the argument and see whether the premises themselves are actually correct, and see whether or not those premises add up to the conclusion. That's what you do when you're engaging with someone's point of view or someone's argument or someone's position. But Alice doesn't do that. Right? Alice is not evaluating the arguments. Alice is not providing her own argument against the conclusion. Not doing any of that. Is rather just saying, forget it all, the person's weird, right? Consider the source somehow. Yeah, the Latin is ad hominem, meaning to the person, right? Or against the person. Yeah. And when you're saying consider the source, right? That's basically the pattern of the argument. You're saying, well, here's an argument, but I don't like where that argument came from. Therefore, the argument is bad. That's a general thing called a genetic fallacy, meaning where the argument came from. And when the source that you're talking about happens to be a person, right? If the problem is the person that came up with it has some sort of defect about them that you are pointing out anyway, rather than addressing the substance of what they've said, then you are committing an ad hominem genetic fallacy, an ad hominem fallacy. So whenever you see that pattern, when it's some irrelevant, now I have to say irrelevant, right? Every now and then someone's personal character matters, right? For example, to establish that someone is a credible witness in a case, then their character matters. So this is why it's not as cut and dry with informal logic as it is with logic, or informal fallacies as it is with invalid arguments. It's not as cut and dry. You have to just think, well, is the person bringing up something that's relevant to the argument being made? Right? And in most cases, when it's just like this, person A presents an argument, and then person B says, oh, but look at that thing that person has wrong with them. Right? Whatever it is, just something to turn people off of that person. Notice that that's completely illogical, but because it works so well in our psychology, people do this all the time. Right? You can just taint somebody just by saying something negative about them, and then everything that comes out of their mouth, if you're successful, people will be more doubtful about it. It's interesting how you can do that, but notice it's manipulating psychology rather than actually engaging in logical critical thinking. Yeah, it is like that. They go hand in hand, and so sometimes, like I said, I can't always draw the line specifically, and I've noticed textbooks waffle on this. Textbooks are not always clear and consistent about this either. So in many cases, you would ask yourself, well, are they really trying to present an argument? I remember taking critical thinking classes and having to evaluate commercials as though they are arguments. Ooh, I'm not so sure about that. I don't think commercials are trying to be arguments, right? I think they're purely trying to be persuasive, right? So I don't think they're even masquerading as arguments. So however we want to use the labels, right, whether it's a persuasive thing or a fallacy, don't get too caught up on that. In either case, you can notice that the person's not doing what you'd expect them to do if they're being a critical thinker. Right? A mild form of hypnotism. Yeah, I mean, any kind of psychological manipulation is like that, isn't it? Yeah. Some people are really good at it, right? Yeah. Yeah. So ad hominem, anytime somebody does that, when it's about an irrelevant personal trait that has nothing to do with the substance of the argument, that's a fallacy, right? They're making a mistake. Right? When you're evaluating a person's position or their argument, keep your focus on their position and their argument. It's as simple as that. It doesn't matter who is saying it or if there's something wrong with them. Is what they've said true? And is it a good argument? That's what you should care about, right? Are the premises that they provided in support of their conclusion, are those premises actually true, and do they support the conclusion? You should be able to do all of that without ever thinking about the person's personal character traits. In most cases, those don't have anything to do with whatever the argument happens to be that you're evaluating, right? So you should separate to the extent you can the argument from the person, right? It's as though you should be able to think that you could transcribe the whole argument onto a piece of paper, forget who even said it, and then look at the arguments and evaluate it, right? You should evaluate arguments, not the people. What sounds like a male thing? I could see somebody trying to make the point either way. The whole argument. Yeah, I'm still not sure what though, but you may have a point, Maggie, but I'm not sure what it is. I mean, if you want to talk about social patterns, I mean, I don't know if that's what you were going to say, but I would say that this does seem to be more of a common pattern among men and males to use this kind of personal attack method. At least on the internet, it's more likely to go down that way. Fragile egos and all that. Maybe you were going to say the opposite of that, but that's my experience anyway. That men seem to be, I don't know, that it's always an overgeneralization, right? Seems to be more of a pattern anyway. To be willing to abuse the people that you're talking to in order to seem to win an argument. Okay, so that's one example. So an ad hominem, I just gave you one example of it right here. But anytime. So just keep your mind sharp to that possibility, right? For what you don't do it, right? You should try not to do that. But then, yes, you can also recognize when somebody else is doing it, right? So at least to not be persuaded by that. Like I said, you don't necessarily want to go rushing in, telling everybody when they've committed an ad hominem. If you ever had to do that, if you were in discussion with someone and they committed what you think is an ad hominem, I think it's better to not say, hey, you committed an ad hominem, that's a fallacy, so you're wrong. I wouldn't do it like that. I would rather say something like, okay, let me see what you're saying. Now, here's the argument we're having. Here's the conclusion that we're arguing about. Now, you mentioned these things about me. What is the logical connection between those things that you mentioned about my personal traits and then the argument that we're discussing here? You see, be more Socratic about it, right? Open it up as a conversation rather than something that you're just using to shut the other person down. So recognize these patterns, know what they're called. I'm just saying, imploring you to not be too hasty and just beating people over the head with these things. If you think somebody made a mistake, if you think someone argued in a fallacious way, keep the technical terminology to yourself, but ask the person questions to try to get them to explain what the connection is. Most likely, we'll find out that there's no connection, right? Okay. Another example. There we go. So again, I'm going to have one person say something, then somebody else respond to it, right? So Mona is not doing the fallacy here. Mona's just saying something. Mona's saying, I think having a universal basic income would be a great idea. Not only would it be great for the economy, it would also provide a safety net for so many underprivileged citizens. That's the argument. I notice, think back to the beginning of the semester, you should be able to look at this little chunk of writing and sort of separate the different elements so that you can see what the argument is, right? The conclusion would be universal income is a good idea. Right? Premise one is universal income would be great for the economy. Right? Premise number two is universal income would provide a safety net for underprivileged citizens. Therefore, universal income is a great idea, right? That's how you should see it in your head. And so then what you should be concerned with is, are both of those premises true? And if they are true, does that support the conclusion, right? You might have to point out some missing premises or something like that, right? Possible. That is your job as a critical thinker. That's what you ought to be doing, right? You ought to be zeroing in exactly on what the person's saying, what is their actual stance, and what are their actual reasons for that stance. That's what you ought to be looking at. But Ravi says, I don't agree at all, right? Meaning they don't agree with the conclusion. They don't think universal basic income is a good idea. I don't agree at all. Sounds like you just want to make this great nation into a fascistic communist regime. Have you seen how well that worked out elsewhere? You see what's gone wrong there? So Mona presented this argument, a very specific conclusion, universal basic income. But Ravi, notice, did not actually address the idea of universal basic income, did not actually address whether the premises were true or false, did not address whether or not the conclusion follows from the premises. That's what you ought to be focused on, right? But instead, Ravi attacked a different conclusion, a different statement. The idea, yeah, you could put it into that perhaps. That's not where this is going, but that's possible that that's the thinking that Ravi had. But I'm not entirely sure if that would work. Okay, it's an okay guess, but notice what Ravi attacked, right? It's all good and well if you want to say your conclusion is false and here's why. But Ravi did not attack the actual conclusion, right? Ravi attacked this idea of turning the US into a fascistic communist regime, which is not something that Mona actually argued for. So Ravi misrepresented Mona's position. Misrepresented it into something that's really easy to bash. Because does anybody want a fascistic communist regime that's similar to other fascistic communist regimes? Does anybody want that? No, most people don't, right? Including Mona, including very left-leaning liberals in the United States. None of them really want a fascistic communist regime, right? So that's simply not what Mona is arguing for, right? But Ravi sort of twisted Mona's position into something much more extreme and much easier to bash. So it's actually a straw man fallacy. Straw man fallacy. It's a little bit like, suppose you're going to have a big fight with somebody, right? Imagine you're two knights and you've been boasting that you're able to beat this person, but instead of beating the person, you just stuff a suit of armor full of straw and beat that instead. Very easy to do, isn't it? It's easy to bash a straw man. And so that's what Ravi did here. Turned Mona's arguments or conclusion into something slightly different. Yes, misrepresenting it to make it easier to attack. So if you're really good at it, you'll make it look like something very, very close, right? For something very close to it. Or you can just sort of rely on people making connections, okay? Because, the idea of a universal basic income it's kind of a socialist idea, right? Even though democratic socialism, as it's practiced in Europe, is nothing like the old school USSR. So you have to know a little bit of history. But Mona is not saying let's turn the United States into what USSR used to be. Not saying that. You're saying, oh well, there's this concept of universal basic income. I think it would be a good idea for these reasons. Okay. Ravi could have easily said, well, I don't think it would actually lead to a good economy. Ravi could have even made an argument and said that, well, if you try to implement universal basic income, then you are opening up the floodgates to communist ideology or something like that, and that will eventually lead to the downfall of the United States. Right? He could have done that even, but he didn't. Right? He simply misrepresented Mona's position from the get-go and attacked that. And in many cases, this is really, 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 really persuasive, unfortunately. Right? It's very simple when I present it to you as, here's what you shouldn't do. Yet at the same time, people do this kind of thing all the time. You might notice that in personal arguments that you have with other people. Very good to be aware of this, not just in the other person, but in yourself as well, right? The kind of thing where you go, oh, I guess you just want me to ... right? Or I guess you just want to be able to ... right? Where you sort of say, oh, I guess this is what you mean, right? This very extreme thing, when that was not necessarily what was intended to begin with. Yeah, so these kinds of things, they can come up in, big social issues, discussions that people have, but also in interpersonal relationships. Yeah. Yeah, that's right, yeah. Yeah, we're not doing Thanksgiving this year either. I mean, we're doing it at home, but I'm not going to go to my mom's and see all my brothers and all that stuff. Yeah, I know, right? But again, you got to do it carefully, though. Do it tactfully, right? Don't just bash them over the head with the label. If you really know that someone has made a mistake, they clearly committed a fallacy, try to be like Socrates, okay? Socrates didn't just tell people that they were wrong. Socrates would ask questions to lead them there so that they can see it themselves. Okay? So do it that way. All right. Use all this information for good. Yeah. Sometimes you just want to stay out of it, right? Yeah. Well, yeah, Socrates, right? Yeah, well, that was the whole thing. Maggie's remembering correctly. I say Socrates would ask questions, so that's a good technique to use anyway. Of course, in Plato's philosophy, Plato wrote the dialogues with Socrates as a character. Plato believed that knowledge is innate, so that makes sense that you could get someone to know something just by asking questions, because it's all already in here. That's sort of a side thing, but that's a cool thing that you remember that, Maggie. Yeah. Yeah. Easier to attack a straw man than a person, right? Easier to attack a misrepresented argument than the actual argument itself. It's a little switch and bait sort of a thing, and it's very, very tricky, and I don't think people always do it on purpose, but people who are good at manipulating people probably do this on purpose and know how to do it. It's something to be aware of. And notice, you can't really formalize this. I can't turn this into a bunch of P's and Q's, right? It just doesn't work that way. Okay, we'll do one more, and then we'll be done for now. And then we'll look at some more fallacies next time. I also have a whole... a different presentation than the Prezi that's a little bit more in-depth. The textbook should be good as well, but you should go ahead and take a look at, it's just on Canvas in this week's module, a PowerPoint presentation that goes through a bunch more of the fallacies. Yeah. Okay, let's do another one. Sam says, aliens definitely exist. I just know it. And Ronnie says, how do you know? Sam says, well, can you prove that they don't exist? See what went wrong here? Ronnie asks Sam to provide reasons for the claim, right? Basically saying, well, what's your argument? You say that you know that aliens exist? What are your premises, right? That's supposed to be the idea. That's how you should present a claim, a controversial claim. If you're going to say that you know that something is true, then you should have an argument to back it up, some evidence to point to. And that's what Ronnie's asking for. Ronnie's not even being dismissive, right? She's being quite nice about it. Well, what's your argument? How do you know that's true? But what does Sam do in response? Basically just implied that the statement was justified because you can't prove it false. You see? It's all these things are always clear when you point them out that it's a mistake. The problem is that people make this mistake all the time. So to see what's going wrong here, let's do a little bit of categorical logic, right? Or some propositional logic, rather. Let's translate that simple statement, aliens exist, put it as an A. Sam is basically saying, well, we don't know that A is false, therefore A is true. That's called an appeal to ignorance. When you say, we don't know that this is false, therefore I get to just say that it's true. You could do it the other way around as well, right? We don't know that it's true, so I can just say that it's false. So whenever someone argues or implies even, right here, it's sort of a roundabout thing. Sam didn't come right out and exactly say that, but essentially that's all Sam has going for his statement that aliens exist. I'm right because you can't prove me wrong, basically, right? But that's a fallacy. You're not right simply because you can't prove that you're wrong, and you're also not wrong simply because you can't prove that you're right. You see how this works? This usually happens in the context of claims that something exists or something is real, when there perhaps is a lack of clear evidence, right? So, life after death is another good example, right? If you just simply look at animals and you see them as biological machines that eventually break down, human beings, why would you expect any different? Right? Our consciousness seems to be an emergent property of the brain in the context of a body. Now, this is all controversial, right? You take a philosophy class and argue the opposite point of that. Just saying, from a certain point of view, you could see that. You could think, well, kind of just makes sense that if you die, it's just done, right? Because you need all this stuff to work, and if it's not working, then where am I? But a lot of people say, well, you don't know, right? It's the great hereafter. You don't know what's happening in the afterlife. But a lot of times it doesn't just stay there as a claim of lack of knowledge. That would be fine if we just said, well, we just don't know. But a lot of times people then try to use that as a way to support the belief in some sort of afterlife. It's like, I believe that there's something waiting for me on the other end because I don't know that it's not, right? People argue in that way. People argue in that way about God as well, right? You can't disprove his existence, right? Therefore, I am justified in believing that God exists, right? It's a similar sort of move. It's whenever you appeal to the fact that we don't know the opposite, therefore your thing is true, right? You see how that works? So you can take any statement that you want to be true, this statement is true because we don't know that its opposite is true. We don't know that its negation is true. Therefore, we know that its affirmation is true. But that's illogical. Right? It's a fallacy to appeal to our ignorance about something to then try to claim knowledge in that way. Okay? So recap, fallacy, just any kind of identifiable pattern of bad reasoning. Something that happens often enough that we can point to it and give it a name. Right? And the ones that we looked at the formal fallacies a while ago, right? Affirming the antecedent, denying the consequent. Ad hominem is where you attack the arguer personally rather than their argument. The straw man is where you attack a position that's actually different from the one that's actually being presented. Right? Something that's easier to bash, easier to knock down. And then the appeal to ignorance. Right? Arguing that a statement can be accepted as true just because we can't prove it to be false. And you might also be able to sometimes find an example where that's reversed. It's usually like this, but you could also find an example where someone says that a statement should be rejected as false because we cannot prove it to be true. In either case, if that's all you have going, then it's an appeal to ignorance. Okay, any questions? It's a good stopping time. You get the basic idea of what a fallacy is. And, it's just a matter of knowing what they each are. And, knowing the label for now anyway. Eventually, the label doesn't matter as much as the pattern. Your ability to spot these patterns. Your ability to recognize that someone is not focusing on the argument. That's usually what's going to be happening here. Most of these fallacies are what's called fallacies of irrelevance. Most of these fallacies basically talk about something else than the actual issue at hand, but they try to make it look like you're talking about it. Okay. Any final questions? Okay. A little easier, I assume, to do this than the other stuff. But keep practicing the categorical logic stuff, okay? Just if you have not checked out that exercise video that's on Canvas, I really recommend that you do that. Or even if you've done it already, just do it again. You probably forgot what you're supposed to do, and I just say, pause it, try to do it yourself, and then see me do it and see how it compares. Okay. Yeah, keep doing them. Good. Okay. The midterm's already up right now. The midterm is up. I put it up yesterday. I mean, unless I forgot to make it public somehow, it should be up.